When you think of famous world-changing ships, you probably think of your big capital ships, your dreadnoughts, fast battleships, or aircraft carriers, like the Kido Butai kicking the United States into World War II. Yet the ship involved in one of the biggest world-changing events was a humble protected cruiser. It's hard to be more directly involved in world events than firing the shot that symbolically kicked off the October Revolution. That ship, the cruiser Aurora, had an eventful life outside of that symbolic shot. Almost immediately after entering service, she was assigned to the Baltic Fleet in 1903. Soon after that entrance, the ship would be sent off to reinforce Russian forces in the Russo-Japanese War. That voyage and the resulting Battle of Tsushima is a story all its own, of course. Aurora was in the thick of that from the start to the end. While she would, as it turns out, survive Tsushima and go on to see a long and successful career surviving both world wars, and the Cold War for that matter, with the ship enduring into the modern day as a museum. Mostly to the Revolution, though Aurora certainly had an eventful life outside of that. In any event, let's start things off with the design before moving to the service history. In this, Aurora was one of the Pallada, or Diana depending, class of cruisers. Protected cruisers that had a tortured development process, to say the least. That's a topic for another video, but it's worth noting here. They were arguably obsolescent upon entering service, with some handling issues to boot, such as a slower than expected speed, along with a tendency to, quote, bury their bow, or steer poorly at low speeds and in high winds. It makes Aurora's success more impressive when you think about it. Either way, let's just briefly note the details of the design here and then move on. First, the displacement. As designed, Aurora displaced around 6,700 tons at her normal load. Rather large by protected cruiser standards, which were typically more in the 4,000 to 5,000 ton range. With that high displacement came a heavy weapons load. Aurora carried 8 152mm 6-inch guns in single mountings, one each on the bow and stern, with the remaining guns carried in broadside mountings. These were, in turn, supported by no fewer than 24 75mm 3-inch guns, as well as 8 single 37mm guns. Weaponry was rounded off at this point by 3 submerged torpedo tubes. Now with that covered, let's look at the armor. As a protected cruiser, Aurora's armor was limited to an armored deck. This was 38mm 1.5 inches in the flat portion, with the sloped side reaching up to 63.5mm or 2.5 inches at its thickest. Right, so far so good. Well, where Aurora falters, and the Russians noted this as an issue, was her speed. The ship was capable of 19 or so knots on 11,610 indicated horsepower. As designed, the goal was 20 knots, but the ship couldn't quite manage it. Either way, with this, we've reached the end of the design segment. Now let's move to the service history, which for Aurora consisted of periods of major excitement and then periods of not much at all. This story began in the Admiralty shipyard of St. Petersburg on May 23, 1897. The ship was laid down that day, but proceeded to have a very lengthy construction period. She was only launched on May 11, 1900, and commissioned on July 16, 1903. 6 years in all. And with the Russo-Japanese War breaking out in early 1904, well, Aurora didn't exactly have much of a peacetime career. The cruiser worked up for a bit and was assigned to reinforce the Pacific Fleet as tensions grew with Japan. As it turned out, she wouldn't do so, at least not right away. Instead, Aurora would end up back in the Baltic. The ship suffered some mechanical issues and had to be refit first. This kept her back until the 2nd Pacific Squadron was put together to reinforce the faltering Russian forces in the Far East. The story of that squadron is a long one, full of mistakes, missteps, drama, and the odd myth or two. It's also been pretty thoroughly covered before, so I won't go into the meat of that tale today, simply Aurora's role in it, which admittedly is some of the more unfortunate aspects. First off, this squadron was a motley mix of ships. Aurora was one of the most modern of the bunch, in spite of her faults. As such, it's not a surprise she was put in with the rest after her refit. It's perhaps also not a surprise that almost immediately things went wrong for this ship. The 2nd Pacific Squadron left Russia on October 2nd, 1904. Within the month, Aurora would suffer her first damage. Damage that came not from the Japanese enemy, but from her comrades in the Russian squadron. On October 22nd, we have the Dogger Bank incident. The Russian fleet, already keyed up and worried over intelligence reports, came upon British fishing trawlers in the night. This somehow led to sightings of phantom Japanese torpedo boats and several minutes of friendly fire, among general chaos aboard the ships. Panicked sailors running around like headless chickens, seeing phantom torpedo boats or invisible Japanese samurai boarding a battleship. Aurora notably received the brunt of the not-so-friendly fire. 7 battleships fired on her and fellow cruiser Dmitry Donskoy. Fortunately, the shooting was not exactly accurate. Even so, Aurora was hit a few times. The cruiser's chaplain was severely wounded and would later die of his wounds. Not exactly a great omen, to say the least. As for the trawlers, one of those was sunk with 2 men killed. 4 others were damaged, with 6 more fishermen wounded, one of whom died a few months later. This kicked off something of a diplomatic firestorm before cooler heads prevailed. As for Aurora, she would prove to be one of the more reliable ships in the fleet as it continued on. Something of a golden child in regard to the ship's performance and that of her crew. That relative competence would serve her well as things continued on, though not without further bad luck from some sources, citing the ever mean Don Kamchatka firing a salute during a funeral for one of her crew at Madagascar, which contrived to include a live shell that slammed into Aurora, thankfully without damage. If true, it's another case of Aurora being used as the Russian punching bag. But that aside, the ship and her crew served well, even if apparently Aurora was a bit overrun by various exotic animals picked up in the stay at Madagascar. That began in December 1904 and continued into early 1905. Among other things, Aurora apparently picked up 2 crocodiles and a large snake. It reached the point the doctor later wrote that the crew had issues sleeping due to worries about the zoo she picked up. Still, all of this was just the lead up to a fateful encounter. The Russian squadron sailed into history not for its wild voyage, but for its conclusion. The Battle of Tsushima from May 27th through May 28th, 1905. Aurora began this battle at the end of the Russian line, forced to watch as the lead ships were blasted apart by the Japanese. And when the cruiser did join the fray, it was only to lose her beloved captain. A direct hit to Aurora's conning tower wounded 3 men and killed the captain outright. Aurora would also dodge an actual torpedo this time, not Phantom Spectres. While none of the damage she took was crippling, Aurora was still suffering during the battle. Men were wounded or killed outright, and the ship had to be careful where she sailed. At several points, actual torpedo boats blocked her and fellow cruiser Oleg's path forward. Eventually, with little realistic choice, Aurora and Oleg turned southwest in the dark night of May 27th, away from Vladivostok. Ultimately, Admiral Oskar Engqvist, the commander of Oleg and Aurora's squadron, turned for Manila. Joined by another damaged cruiser, the 3 ships sailed on, during which Aurora's doctor assembled an X-ray apparatus and took the first X-rays on a Russian warship after a battle. In any event, by early June 1905, Aurora and her comrades were in Manila Bay, where they would be interned on June 6th, waiting for the final end of the Russo-Japanese War. With 15 of the crew, captain included, lost at or after Tsushima. With the Russo-Japanese War coming to its end on September 5th, 1905, Aurora was allowed to return home. The battered cruiser would reach Russian waters by early 1906, where she would promptly be put into a new, far less taxing role, a cadet training ship to rebuild the shattered Russian fleet. After a major overhaul from 1906 through 1907 and another refit from August 1908 to August 1909. Among other things, her main battery was increased to 10 6-inch guns. The torpedo tubes were removed as well. Ultimately, Aurora would make 6 training cruises in this role between 1906 and 1914, including one to Thailand, rivaling her ill-fated time with the 2nd Pacific Squadron. Featuring, instead of a major naval battle, celebrations for the coronation of Siams, Thailand's new king, in November 1911. Now this was an important duty to be sure. The Russian fleet needed to rebuild, and that meant new sailors needed to be trained. And trained better this time to avoid a repeat performance. Aurora, as a modern cruiser, was a good option. She had relatively extensive facilities and was cheaper to sail than a battleship. I can see why the Russians put her to use this way, though it meant her time, up to the Great War, would be fairly quiet. Something that would continue into the Great War when that broke out at the end of July 1914. Aurora would remain in the Baltic, put to use mostly on patrol and shore bombardment, or the odd escort duty during mine-laying operations. In all cases, however, she generally avoided direct combat with German naval forces, a perfectly valid strategy in the face of German naval superiority, even if it means she didn't have much in the way of big famous things for the active part of the Great War service. The most notable thing outside of this was a refit in 1915. Aurora lost 16 75mm guns in exchange for moving to 14 6-inch guns, taking 4 guns from her sister Diana. The ship also picked up 4 75mm anti-aircraft guns, and a 40mm Vickers gun. Aurora would continue in this guise through 1916 before being pulled back again in September of that year for another refit, though events would overtake the ship, Russia, and the world. While under refit, Aurora's crew became more and more radicalized. Most of the sailors became Bolsheviks, or at the least supporters of the Bolsheviks. The officers generally remained more Tsarist, including the captain Mikhail Nigolsky. Though much like the crew, how Tsarist the officers were varied. Some were simply more in favor of the legitimate government. Regardless, things came to a head in early 1917. Part of the crew joined in with the February Revolution. The captain didn't and would end up murdered by the crew. Some sources will cite other officers being killed as well, while others will cite only the captain. Aurora hoisted a red flag at this point and became the first major Russian warship to do so. Not much would happen beyond this until October 1917, or rather November, using the Gregorian calendar. At this point, Aurora was ordered to close a bridge which was held by loyalist cadets. Aurora anchored near the bridge to do so. All well and good. However, while anchored near the bridge, her more famous role came into play. At around 9:45 p.m. on October 25, 1917, Aurora fired a blank shell. This is commonly cited as a signal for storming the Winter Palace, the quote-unquote first shot of the revolution. For context, that was November 7th under the Gregorian calendar. Because of that shot, Aurora entered the history books, even if her actual role in the revolution would be fairly minor at this point. Her guns were removed and used as floating batteries, but the cruiser left the active role at this point. Once the Russian Civil War came to its ultimate end, Aurora would return to service as a training ship. She operated in this role from 1922 through the start of the Second World War. Not much of note happened, aside from receiving the Order of the Red Banner in 1927. As for World War II, the old ship was disarmed. Her guns were put to use defending Leningrad, while Aurora was bombed and shelled periodically, variously described as run aground or sunk outright in September 1941. Aurora would remain in Leningrad's harbor through 1944. Her flag remained flying the entire time as a symbol of defiance. Only then was she raised and repaired, though not to return to service. Aurora would, after the end of the war, be converted into a floating memorial, and later in 1957 to a full-on museum ship, a role she has remained in ever since through various refits and overhauls, most recently in 2014 through 2016. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.